Hi everyone, this is Kapil. I work as a freelance front-end developer. I mostly work on React Stack, and I apologize for the topic change. Originally it was like a JAMStack write app for 2025, but I couldn't find enough numbers or benchmarks to prove that like it was better and it was like kind of justified to do, like it was a future way of writing. So I modified the talk title to Jamstack Decoded. We will go through what Jamstack means on a conceptual level. So okay, one sec. My slides are visible, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so what is Jamstack stands for? So Jam and the Jamstack is JavaScript API and markup. So when we say stack in the Jamstack, we don't specifically mean any kind of technology or framework or backend or front end. We don't mean that by Jamstack. So JavaScript is kind of like more like on a conceptual level, but not hard code as like a defined as a technology. And one more thing, like interesting point that I could make right now is Jamstack as a term was coined by the Netlify as a like marketing term. So right now Gatsby's kind of started to offer similar kind of uh, cloud services. Now they are trying to move away from the uh, Jamstack tag. So and they are going into more into incremental builds sort of term. So okay, so in the uh, Jam, J stands for JavaScript. So that's the main language of the web, right? We write the client side app or web apps which render on the browser. They mostly use, or the main language is JavaScript. When we say A for API, though there are two types of APIs involved in a front end, or what do you say, a modern web application. That is one are browser APIs, your local storage, HTTP API, and the external APIs like you do for HTTP API calls. You ask for some data, do some kind of like web sockets and all that. So there is like internal web so there is like internal web APIs and external APIs. And when we say markdown, this is not the markdown we use, but it's HTML. Sorry, it should be markup, I think. Yeah, I did a total mistake. So M is actually for markup, not markdown. Markdown is like a content format that people use to write documents. So it should be actually markup. So markup in the Jam specifies for HTML markup. So in any web application that we use, server or server send the HTML markup from either the server or client side frameworks, compile that markup on the client side, and that's the end content, right? The markup that we render on the browser, that's your HTML markup. So these things combined make it as a Jamstack technology. Okay, so who is this not for? What Jamstack is not for? So this is mostly as a joke. Admit. So this is mostly as a joke. Like Jamstack is not for glorified CRM and CMS developers. Most business apps, I would say that they are mostly they mostly fall into the category of CRM apps, right? Most business tools. And CMS developers, when I say CMS, is like when we build any kind of dynamic systems for to generate content, that's mostly a CMS, right? But it's on more advanced and custom level, but it's mostly a CMS. So people who do want to sell like advanced technology solutions to their customers, and it that's the large part of the industry is built upon, and I'm also part of that group. So it's not for them. Who is this for? people who do care about their customers and people who do care like what their customers want and how they can do it with more simplicity. So let's look into that. Okay, so this is the problem with modern web apps, right? Okay, so this is a very simple diagram of what a web application look like and a Jamstack application looks like. Okay, so even in a simple level, so in a very simple web application, there are like 3 4 tiers. So you have your web server, then there is application server, which kind of your like Node app, Python app, Ruby app, something like that. And there is there your database, right? So your application server talks. So when you need one piece of data, what's the usual process like for a modern web app? That is, a browser sends a request to your web server, then your web server forwards that request to your application server, that is your node server, something like that. Then your node server runs a SQL query, something like that, a MongoDB query, and it requests that data from the database, and then the application server returns that to web server and the browser. So that's like 8, I think. So that's a lot of work for one simple piece of data. With Jamstack, that's very simplified. So like with Jamstack, you could see here in the diagram, there is just your browser and CDN. That's it. The browser wants data, it will go ask the CDN that data, and the CDN returns it. There are no middlemen in between that. So how is that really possible? We'll go into that later. So let's look into more like what are the existing problems with the web application that we build right now. I don't know. Okay. Okay. Mhm. So when we say web applications right now, you could like say there are mostly three types of web applications. First is the diagram that I've shown. It runs a traditional kind of like CMS backend server, a web WordPress or something like that. There is your SPA, that is single page application that we do in Angular or React, and then there is like SSR, something like Next.js, right? So where we compile the markup on the server and then send that data to the client. So I will go one by one on what overhead these ways have right now to serve the content, right? So I already talked about a traditional web server technology, right? You have to go to browser request data to a web browser, sorry, a web server, then the web server talks to application server talks to a database, then database sends the data to your application server goes back to your web server, and then finally it gets the data, right? So there's a like lot of communication that's really not needed to do each time. Yeah, so that was about the web server. Okay, so let's talk about SPA, single page application, your modern front end apps, right? So even in your SPA, when your client side application needs any data to show to your client, right? So what's the usual process like for a SPA app to load or render, right? So first a server will send a JavaScript bundle, right? Then the JavaScript bundle gets passed on to the client side. It will kind of like parse all the JS, create your create React on your client side, and whatever your React code is written, and then it will compile a HTML markup on the client side. That usually takes kind of like 4 to 5 seconds on a normal web application, which doesn't have heavy dependencies. uh, People who have like don't use lazy loading or other techniques, like who don't minimize bundles, their bundles get larger and larger, and it gets pretty heavy to do that passing thing on the client side, especially you have uh, when you have large base of customers on your mobile, right? So I, not to brag, but to show you, like I have iPhone, right? This is the modern iPhone X10, and on any like modern app I use as a client or as a web app on mobile, when I use that on the browser, it takes like 8 to 10 seconds kind to like load and run that app and be interactive, right? That's a lot, and this is my modern phone, right? People, large part of your customers don't have access to these powerful and rich phones, right? And I also have this Redmi phone, right? This was 3 4 years back. This takes like twice time than my iPhone. And imagine, and these are like modern phones, right? So imagine what kind of time, or it used to. Some people have benchmarked like your normal web application, which are popular, takes like 30 40 seconds to load on old devices, and that's a lot. I don't think that we care about like customer experience when we are sending huge bundles that are difficult to pass on small mobiles or less powerful devices. So that's the huge problem with SPA, right? Let's talk about SSR, right? Again, so SSR actually do the is halfway there, right? So it doesn't do the bundling on the client side. It compiles the markup on server side and sends a compiled markup to client side, right, from the server. But it still has that web server overhead, right? So on each request, so let's take a example for a e-commerce app, right? Again, Amazon or something like that. You're buying a phone, you go to specific brand model, right? So how many times does a phone information change or the price change? Not a lot, right? But each time a client or a user is requesting that web page, that request still gets served or passed on the back end, and each page is reloaded, right? Each data is fetched from the database, and it still needs a server. That request still needs to get processed, right? So I think that's still kind of overhead when if you look at the if you really look at how frequently your data changes, you will start to see or recognize that this is the problem and this could be optimized. So yeah, this is just a joke, GF. Does this really need to be this complicated? I don't think so. We can actually simplify the process, I guess. So let's talk about the advantages of JAMStack, like what JAMStack brings or does different that still has like a leg ahead rather than even the modern front end that we do build. Like SSR is still like a Next.js or something like that. That's still like a fresh technology, right? It's still in the market and it still has come out. And how does Jamstack even goes further that like what how much or what additional value it even adds even from the latest technologies. You're on mute. Sorry, I'm not audible.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay, probably he has some issues.
Okay. Anyone pinging you on the chat?
Am I audible to you?
Yes, yes, you are audible.
I get. So Jamstack started seeing this problem, and people around like 2013 or 14, that there could be a different way to build front end web apps. Okay, all good. Okay, so they started to see this problem and how we can really solve that. Okay, so let's start looking at the advantages. Okay, so performance. Okay, so when we say about the performance, static site generation, that's the first performance feature which Jamstack brings, right? Okay, so in a usual, in a normal or a general Jamstack app, I'm not talking about a specific technology or a framework here like Gatsby, Jekyll, Hugo. You could choose any of them. We are talking about the concept like static site generation. It's a common thing in Jamstack. That's the like main thing. Like all your content gets built. Okay. One second. I don't think. I don't have a slide. Sorry, I don't have a slide for to explain like what's how does a Jamstack build. So I'll probably just explain it here. Okay, with this diagram. Okay. Then maybe we could talk about the advantages that it brings. Okay, so in a normal Jamstack application, how does it work or build, right? So we build our React application, right? There is a with if you use like a create React app, there is a specific build command that builds all the assets and your JS assets and everything, right? So with Jamstack, what you have in the build process is it will try to build all your okay, maybe I need to go this in bit detail. Okay, okay, hmm. so consider that you have your data source, right? So in a normal Jamstack app, you would use something like a headless CMS or other CMS. You could use any data source. You could use some markdown files. That's okay. There is no hard and fast rules about that. So there is your data source, right? So let's talk about an example of an e-commerce app, right? So you have 10, 1500, probably just your probably your small store, right? So you have 100 products to sell, right? So what you do is uh, store all your uh, product information in a data source, right? Rather than storing that on a DB, right? And depending upon a specific DB or a technology, you store that in a CMS or a data source like Markdown, something like that. And what Jamstack app will do on the build time is it will build each page for that. So whatever your app structure is for your e-commerce app, like your home page, and there is like a detail page for each product. So Jamstack, what will it will do? So is it will create an individual page for each of your product on the build time, and that product gets served over a so you have your 100 pages build, right? You have 100 product. So on the build time, what it will do is it will build 100 pages in the build process, and all of that is like stored as a markup, right? All of those are markup files that could be directly sent to a browser. And those 100 files, something like that, with the whole application, you could store that on a CDN is like content delivery network. We have been using CDNs from long time, but only for like serving static assets like images, right, or video. So in that case, we our web application or content is also a static asset, right? It's already compiled HTML file. So this our build is served from a CDN network, so it also has this performance. Okay, we'll talk about the performance, but it gets served from a CDN to a client app, to the browser directly. So there is your build process, but when a when a user requests a a web page for like a specific phone, it won't have this runtime or dynamic query where it will ask for detail or information on a web server or any data. It's already built and kind of like pre-rendered into a specific page. That page will get sent from CDN. And the thing about like, okay, I'll talk about that in caching again. So that's how a usual Jamstack app looks like. Given that, you could also add, so what do you say about like dynamic part of your application, right? You need a chat system, probably you need a payment gateway integration, right? You could also add, so here comes the microservices. Can I add a service? I'll answer that at the end, right? Okay, so so you could throw in any backend services as in you like, as like a separate module, but not as it but that won't be the core part of your app. Okay, so let's, okay, so let's look into the advantages. Okay, right? So performance. So when we say performance, so Jamstack is mostly a concept based on like static site generation. I explained right now like what does a static site generation happens. You have your data source, you have your queries on the clients in your web application. So you specify like what kind of content you have in your application, like, hey, I have 100 products for my e-commerce store, and you write 10 or 20 line code where you specify like, okay, for this product page, I have this template and I have this data. You do the data mapping in your template, and voila, you have 100 pages built as like a pre-built marker that could be easily sent from server to a browser. No need for a server, no need for like a node server or a web server, right? It could be statically served directly from the CDN. Okay, so lazy loading. Huh. So lazy loading as in like, it's not a native it's not like kind of like first thing in the Jamstack, right? We have been using lazy loading in the normal web app or front end apps as well, but in Jamstack there is a very high focus, or you could say like a high kind of like importance given to lazy loading of assets. So you have image content or any heavy content. There are techniques which are mostly right now like invented or developed by Jamstack frameworks, or so there are specific techniques like uh, for lazy loading of images that are heavily focused in Jamstack apps, right? Again, so caching again. So I talked about like how static site generation works, right? It's like markup or single file. It's pre-built and ready to be served, right? So it really helps uh, it with the caching part, right? Because with the your dynamic front end application, right, you can do the JavaScript bundling caching, right? You could cache your JavaScript bundles. That's the more uh, heavy part in your front end application, but you still have to do the data calls on the back end, right? So with static site generation or Jamstack, you have to do that, right? Your first time your file gets sent to a client side, and you can always just cache it on the client side, right? And the next time the user visits, you don't need to request the data or anything from the backend side. You could just reserve the what was the existing requested pre-rendered file. So that's about caching. Security. Okay, I'm not going to go into detail about security aspects. So there is a concept in information security, that is surface area, right? Okay, so when we talk about a web application, I showed you the diagram previously, if you remember. There were four parts, right? So there is your web server, there is your app server, there is your database. So you have potentially four areas, and this was like a minimal app, right? The modern apps are more difficult and more kind of infrastructure heavy, right? So it gets complicated with the more pieces of technology you have in your build process or in your serving process. You add the security complexity, right? In India right now, so I'm talking about specifically about India, like, so we don't specifically, okay, I'll probably answer that later. So in India we don't really do care much about security, right? But we recently had a scuffle with China, right? They have like largest kind of like force of hackers in the country that are employed by state government. And same goes with Russia and other states, not just those two, but those are two most dangerous. So with our like a mentality kind of thing, we don't really care about the security part. But the more pieces you add to your infrastructure, the more exposure it gets for like security, right? When you have five things, you have five things to consider for security. You have to analyze and fix though. You have to first analyze. Okay, so I have five pieces that are part of my web process, web application, right? So you need to analyze all the risks and errors or security threats that are available in the system. With Jamstack, there is no web server or anything database, right? It's all on the build process, not on the dynamic or run. So it's not exposed. So there is like less surface area. I hope I got this concept clear. So there is a less surface area to cover because you have less pieces of technologies to worry about for exposure for security purposes. Okay, so how does the scaling work, right? So how is better for scaling? So CDN and microservices or serverless functions again. So I talked about CDN, content delivery networks. CDNs were actually built for the means of specifically for the purpose of scaling or serving static assets like audio, video, right? And images. Your typical node server, the what we use, it it was not meant or it was not developed to be like, it wasn't taken consideration like this should like serve or how this would scale. It was developed like, it was developed more using consideration of how much developer experience and speed, but not the scaling, right? The scaling part was left upon developers and companies to think upon, right? So the CDN helps with the scaling because there is no piece or like you're not limited by your technology, right? So there is no node server, there is no Ruby server, there is no Python or anything like that, right? It's all static content that could be served by CDN spread across globe. And add in, okay, so we haven't talked much about the backend part, right? The dynamic part if you need. So how you could add dynamic part to your web apps or front end apps, that could be using microservices or serverless functions. So you have your complete you have your complete web app, right? But you need some dynamic part in that. like payment gateway integration, right? So you have something like Razorpay or PayPal. So a customer has purchased, so and you need some kind of like backend backend function that will handle that checkout process, where it will take uh, price and products that are that checked out by a customer, and do the payment thing with the payment gateway integration and return uh, success result, failure result, whatever it is, so to the client side application, right? You could easily optimize or modularize that into a serverless or microservice, right? And unlike your monolithic web applications, microservices or serverless functions were built for the specific part for scaling. So you are not dependent on how your microservices is deployed, right? The platforms like I don't need to like glorify the microservices or serverless functions part. We already know that like how serverless functions can scale without being limited, like how they are used, right? You don't need to care about that. There is your serverless function, and AWS or whatever platform that you use, it will take care of the rest of the scaling. Okay, okay, so this is the last one. So I am in a more like so I mentioned at first, like I am also a freelancer, right? So I'm self-employed. Maybe someday I do want to have like an indie business or something like that. So how does it compare to Jamstack, right? So with static content, people don't really kind of admit this, like static content has better SEO results. So so Google or any search engines that customers use, your static content will always have a preference, or kind of like they will get ranked better than dynamic content. Of course, that also depends on the other factors that are considered into SEO. But if you compare a dynamic content versus a static content in SEO, static content will do better. That means more organic traffic and less paid marketing. Okay. Yeah, so this is the probably question that I think a lot of people may have. Why not just then use plain HTML, right? You are already serving that, so why not just use it? So the problem with that is like there is no way right now to how to like add dynamicity to that HTML. Like I explained like how you can add a back not necessarily, maybe I wanted okay so why not just so there is no way right now that you could add dynamic parts in your HTML. That you do is using JS, and then we will go to the same problem again, right? So that's why uh, compared to like Gatsby, you have like you write your applications like with the modern tooling with like a framework like React, but you serve them as a static. So you go from like back so you when you write, you have the most advanced tools for writing or developing the application. But when serving the content, you use the old technology, like you are sending that as HTML markup. Okay, thanks. So I recently watched Friends. I never watched it, and I recently watched it completed all seasons. So maybe this is for the Friend fans. uh any questions are welcome. Let me just go through the chat. Can add a service worker to it? Yes. So Jamstack app is your could be like defined as a it's on a conceptual sorry, not on conceptual but it's same as like your front end app, but with a different kind of serving techniques. But yeah, you can add JavaScript to your markup with it, or send it on initial request and add a service worker to it.
Hey Kapil, great talk. So I wanted to know like if there are like
Just one second. How it will work out in a system where data is coming from some pipeline in DB continuously, and we're powering some kind of dashboard. So I specifically had a specific uh, slide for this, that Jamstack is probably not for glorified CRM developers, right? So this dashboard thing kind of sounds like a CRM, so it's probably not a good choice for that as well. Not necessarily, it may be more due to speed that I don't think I understand. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
yep. So if my pages keep increasing, will the build time also keep increasing, right? So how can it tackle that?
Yeah. So they how Jamstack solve right now, that is like they have kind of like atomic deployments, right? So or incremental build. So these are like terms defined by, like Gatsby calls it incremental deployments, Netlify calls it something else. But the core part of that, so the core like concept is like when creating builds, instead of starting from scratch or something like that, instead you can have hooks, like kind of like hooks attached to your data source, and when a specific type of data source changes, only the content related to that changes. So you solve that. So the first builds could be like take more time, but the subsequent builds would take less time. I think it was question of if your data size increases, it will take time. Yeah, it will take time. You will need some kind of like, so on the build time or on the first build time, you'll need like something like a heavy. As your data source increases, you'll need some more build power at that, just for the build time. Yeah. So that problem can be easily solvable, right?